My name is Adrian Dunbar. I'm perhaps best known as an actor, but I also direct. In many people's opinion, Samuel Beckett is the most influential artist of the 20th century.
Better if the brim is
flat.
Yeah.
His work has become a source and a resource for directors, actors, sculptors, and of course, other writers. And Beckett has a special draw for me because of the connections he has with my native county, Fermanagh.
Page 40, paragraph 4.
His play, Waiting For Godot, still remains the last time that theatre was profoundly changed.
Sequence will just have even more power in it for some reason.
Beckett once said that his life was completely separate from his work. But then again, someone else remarked that he never wrote anything he had not lived himself. And that's where the enigma begins. Samuel Beckett went to school here in my hometown of Enniskillen. And I was aware of Samuel Beckett growing up as a child. But when I went to the Guildhall School of Music and Drama and started my journey as an actor, I saw a production of Waiting For Godot, and at the end of it, I just did not know how this man had got me to a place where I was so moved by the compassion of the piece. I didn't know how he did that. It seemed like an abstract play to me. And then the question started to arise, who was Samuel Beckett? What were the journeys in his life that really set him on the road to being this incredible innovator in literature and the theatre? And so I decided that I'd have to make that journey myself. Most people know Beckett from the photos taken of him as an older man. But what was the youthful Beckett like? And how did he get a reputation for being bleak, even obscure, when personally I find engaging with his work life-affirming and uplifting? What was it about those early years that informed his imagination up to the writing of Waiting For Godot? It was here in his adopted home of Paris that Samuel Beckett died 30 years ago. It's the city which inspired him, the city where he wrote the play which sent a lightning bolt into the theatre of the 20th century, changing drama forever. An attendant Godot, a tree, a country road, evening, two figures in the landscape. Godot was a moment that became a movement. It propelled Beckett into the stratosphere, making him the world's most famous playwright. I would go further, perhaps the most important.
Il avait dans les yeux cette inexplicable tristesse.
I never met Samuel Beckett, but his life, while elusive, is still within touching distance. I'm going to spend some time with some of the people who actually met this intensely private man.
I don't know how many rolls of film I put through cameras on Samuel Beckett. I mean, even photographing his letterbox in Paris.
John Minahan was a young newspaper photographer whose working life brought him face to face with Samuel Beckett.
It was the summer of 1969, and a backbench sub-editor screamed across rather scornfully that some obscure Irish writer has just won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and do we have any photographs? And from that moment, I knew I had to go and photograph this obscure Irishman. My signature picture had to be Beckett in Paris. He lived in the City of Light. 20 to 5, he says to me, "John, would you like to take a photograph?" And I point the camera at Sam, and his eyes leave me, as if I don't exist at all.
When Beckett was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature 50 years ago, judges praised his work for evoking the futility of modern life. It wasn't immediately clear if he would be classed as a French writer or an Irish one. Ambiguity and uncertainty became hallmarks of his work, including the title of his most famous play.
Samuel Beckett. He was well known on the Rue Saint-Denis, which is the red light area in Paris. And somebody said that Waiting For Godot was a catchphrase when the women ask each other, who are you waiting for? And they'd reply to each other, J'attends Godot. And he could have picked it up.
No one knows for sure where he got the title. People found Godot difficult and obscure. The shock of the new was too much.
Why doesn't he put down his bags?
You're being asked a question.
People stormed out of Waiting For Godot, didn't they?
Yeah, but...
And, crazy.
Bags!
My fellow actor Stephen Rea was lucky enough to have worked with Beckett in the 1970s. Can you remember the first time you laid eyes on Sam Beckett?
Like, this was very major for me, Adrian, as you would know. You know, I was kind of pulled into the inner circle of Beckett performers. The wonderful thing about them was that they had no fear of it. No. You know, there was a fear grew up around about Beckett. Oh, well, we don't get it, we don't understand it, what's he playing at and everything. But the thing that I found with Beckett, he never, ever talked about meaning. He only ever talked about adding more humour.
You know, that's the source of Waiting For Godot, Ruby.
James Knowlson knew Beckett for over 20 years, eventually writing the definitive biography, Damned to Fame. If I'm to get answers to my questions about Beckett, he is one of the best people to ask.
What did he call you? Just call you James or Jim or...
Jim.
He called you Jim?
Yes.
Right from the start?
Yes. I guess I must have quickly been told to call him Sam. He was very magnetic when you went into a room, and there he would be leaning against the mantelpiece like an Aztec eagle, an upright, middle-distance rudder, this extraordinarily kind of charismatic figure.
Barry McGovern is one of the most acclaimed Beckett actors of his generation. A fellow Dubliner, he knew and was directed by Beckett.
So, look, Barry, you are as good an expert as any expert on Beckett because you've been looking at him and working with him and studying since you were a student.
He had a fierce loyalty to his friends, and there was a fierce quality about him, a fierce integrity.
Yes.
He saw the world as a place of great suffering, which it is, but we kind of ice over the suffering and we make things nice to survive.
Yeah.
But he saw lifting the stone and seeing all the awfulness underneath.
Beckett saw darkness at the end of the Second World War and is associated with the depression and pessimism generated by that conflict. But it would be wrong to believe that he was without humour. On the contrary.
The Royal Court at that time was run by Bob Kidd, and we're all standing on the stage, and Sam was there, and he said, "Well, Sam, happy?" Beckett roared his leg off, and we were all just beside ourselves with pleasure, you know. Yeah. I mean, imagine, you're talking to the arch pessimist of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Happy?
And this was the best advice I've ever heard about Beckett. Whatever you do, Jim, don't treat him like a great man. He hates being treated like a great man. He said, you know, I've always regarded my life as, on the one hand, and my work as completely separate from it. So I said, but all these images from your childhood, Sam. And he said, you're right, Jim, you're right. They're obsessive.
They're obsessive.
These images.
I've come right back to the beginning, to Ireland, to explore his formative years. Beckett was born on Good Friday 1906, the second of 2 children in a solidly middle-class family. I use the words you taught me. If they don't mean anything anymore, teach me others or let me be silent. Surely the seeds of his imagination are sown in his Dublin childhood. And as his great hero Joyce once remarked, an Irishman's heart is nothing but his imagination.
Dublin is a place of great contrasts. You know, Dublin has status. You know, its status is declining. There was a time when Dublin was regarded as the second city of the empire, and it had that Georgian facade, which was once referred to as this gorgeous mask of Ireland's distress. People were packed into tenements. The death rates for infants were appalling. They were some of the worst slums that you could find. Beckett, of course, comes from a completely different milieu.
The Becketts led a comfortable life in the family home of Culdrina in Foxrock, a wealthy suburb of South Dublin. They were part of the ruling minority Protestant community in an overwhelmingly Catholic Ireland.
He was born into that whole history of colonialism in Ireland. You know, that really strange mixture of being Irish but being Protestant and slightly outside of what it was to be Irish, and all of that kind of grain that was going on.
The Beckett boys and their contemporaries were brought up to expect positions of authority inside the British Empire. The church, the army, the civil service, or perhaps the family business. The prevailing ethos was one of civic, Christian responsibility. Every day they took the train to private school in the centre of Dublin, passing through Dublin's slums.
He may have been shielded from some of that because he was taking the Dublin slow and easy every day into Harcourt Street Station and going back to Foxrock. And
absolutely. He was listening to the people on the street.
Pick it up there, get on with it from there. God is love, tender mercies, new every morning. Back in the field, April morning, pick it up there.
Not I is such an incredible piece. Basically, it's a woman howling from the margins of Ireland's history.
Nothing but the larks, pick it up there, get on with it from there. Out into this world, tiny little thing, before its time, in a God for what?
He said that he didn't make up one word of Not I. He heard it from old women walking around the roads near where he lived. So the women were out there on the road speaking. He was listening. He couldn't have been blind to all that.
Girl. Yes, tiny little girl, into this, out into this, before her time, in the godforsaken hole called.
Beckett's father, Bill, spent all week in his office as a chartered surveyor. At weekends, he took Sam as often as he could to the sanctuary of the surrounding Dublin hills.
For me, it starts with his father. The deepest relationship, although hardly anything was said between them, is this relationship he had with his father.
You are so right, Adrian. It is so important. But when you get to it, the father figure is there all the time. It's a regular image that recurs.
Everything in Beckett's writing is, you begin by walking. You walk your way into thought, you walk your way into action. It's everywhere. His walks with his father along the Ballyogan Road and up the mountains, and, you know, even he projects a memory onto the time when he was born, of his father going out for a walk, you know, because his father couldn't stay there. You know, so walking became the way of communicating. And this notion of the coat becomes this symbol in Beckett's work. You know, that heavy overcoat of his father's, you know, and the boots.
This is, I think, where we find the landscape of his youth, the landscape of the places where he spent with his father on huge walks around here. They went for, 10-mile walks constantly. He said, refer to them as fanatical trampers.
When he was going on those walks with his father in the Wicklow Hills, I mean, they're in his early stuff, but they're also throughout his work. Yeah. He mentions names again. In Malloy, he talks about the Malloy country and Ballyba and Ballybaba and what these names mean, and you can just tell where it is if you know the area. Yeah. And if you don't know the area, it doesn't matter. It's suddenly the universality of it comes out.
Two figures in the landscape, of course.
Exactly. Two figures in landscape is essentially Beckettian. And he's very evocative when he talks about remembering back to being a child and walking with his father and holding onto his hand, and then later when they weren't holding hands and just silently going on. As he says himself at one stage, we were never on our way in particular, anywhere, but just on our way.
Women bond face to face, but men bond shoulder to shoulder.
Absolutely. I think that's very interesting. You're right, that with the father, there's a strange sort of intimacy with them. But you know, it's an absolute silent intimacy. But it's a hugely affecting intimacy.
Beckett's mother, May, dominated the family, and theirs was an emotionally tense relationship. A strong, opinionated woman. I think she and Sam were cut from the same cloth.
The formality, the courtesy, the old-style manners of that upbringing had rubbed off onto him, so that it was very striking, this in his gentlemanly conduct. It was a very strong, passionate, and difficult relationship, the mother.
For me, that slightly odd relationship with his mother is very present in Company. You know, the scene where he comes out of Connolly's stores and he's holding his mother by the hand, and he's a little boy just walking along, and he looks up at the sky, and obviously Beckett was always questioning, always looking around him. And he looks up at the sky and he says to his mother, you know, how can we be sure, you know, how far away it is or what the colour of the sky is? And, you know, she shook off his little hand, you know, and she gave him a cutting retort which he has never forgotten.
For some reason you could never fathom, this question must have angered her exceedingly. For she shook off your little hand and made you a cutting retort you have never forgotten.
That, for me, as a mother, is deeply moving.
He loved her very much. I am what her savage loving has made me, he said in a letter, which is a very significant phrase. The element in Krapp's last tape, by the canal waiting for the blinds to go down, with the mother dying in Krapp's last tape story, is very similar to the story of Beckett waiting for his mother, who died in the home there, which is right beside the canal. There is, of course, the house on the canal where mother lay a-dying in the late autumn after her long vacuity, and the bench by the weir from where I could see her window. I was there when the blind went down, one of those dirty brown roller affairs, throwing a ball for a little white dog, as chance would have it. I happened to look up, and there it was, all over and done with at last.
The
start of the 20th century brought with it massive social upheaval and carnage. The 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin against British rule and the wider war in Europe were Sam's first exposure to the savagery of war. The execution of the leaders of the 1916 revolution turned public opinion in Ireland towards independence.
He was 10 years old in 1916, and we know that the Beckett family, along with quite a lot of the residents from around here, while Dublin was burning during the Easter Rising, went and overlooked the city from the hills and were peering down, wondering what was going on, what was going to happen. So it's a point of turmoil. Coming very much home to Foxrock, to the environs of the very comfortable middle-class place he's living in.
With rising nationalist sentiment in Dublin, the city was becoming an unsafe place for a middle-class boy from Foxrock.
You could see why the senior Becketts would have been thinking, this is no place for our boys. Send them somewhere that seems far removed from the Troubles, somewhere where they will not only get a good education, but they will be prepared for a life of eminent respectability. This is where Beckett's voyage also becomes very interesting and quite difficult.
100 miles northwest of Dublin lies Enniskillen, where I grew up. It was a garrison town where Lower and Upper Lough Erne meet. My hometown on its own island can at times seem more liquid than land.
So with the troubles in Dublin, Beckett's parents decided to send his brother Frank and him north here to Enniskillen to Pretoria School, a good Protestant school where they get a decent education.
Beckett excelled at rugby and cricket, and I have no doubt Lough Erne's moods and atmospheres stayed with him, resurfacing in his work many years later.
The thing that really struck me about Pretoria was the boats, the water, and his whole thing. I mean, Crapsass tape, and many of his shorter stories.
Steering still.
Upper Lake with the punt, bathed off the bank, then pushed out into the stream and drifted. She lay stretched out on the floorboards with her hands under her head and her eyes closed. I noticed a scratch on her thigh and asked her how she came by it. "Picking gooseberries," she said. I asked her to look at me, and after a few moments she did, but the eyes just slits because of the glare. I bent over her to get them in the shadow, and they opened. Let me in. We drifted in among the flags and stuck.
It's like he absorbed everything,
yes,
and then remade it into something else.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, the whole business of being up there at such an informative age, the reflectiveness of water, the quietness of that place, you know, and it allowing you to absorb things and think about yourself.
He came back to Dublin and Trinity College in the immediate aftermath of the Irish Civil War. The conflict that raged over the last decade had been a fertile ground for new writers, and at Trinity, Beckett was exposed to ideas far removed from his sheltered upbringing.
And so it is here in 1923 that the young 17-year-old Samuel Beckett arrives up from Pretoria to do his BA in Trinity College, Dublin, just across the road from the Parliament, the seat of the Protestant ascendancy, here in Ireland since 1592. Nearly 6 foot tall, reddish brown hair, piercing blue eyes, wearing his little metal rimmed glasses. He went out into the city and he went to the Abbey Theatre. He was there at the first night of The Plough and the Stars and Juno and the Paycock, and he particularly loved the work of John Millington Synge. And it was on this very cricket pitch, as part of a university team playing a Northampton side that was touring from the UK, that he found himself the only Nobel laureate who's ever been entered in wisdom.
a cricketing Bible.
I love the idea of him here in Trinity being a real brat, you know, because, you know, some of the most interesting students here are kind of brattish.
You spend long enough in a place like this, if you're a sponge, you just absorb everything.
Yeah.
Well, really it was his last year rather than the first 2 years where he really put on the spurt, because he read voluminously in the Trinity Library and worked very, very hard and got a gold medal and a scholarship at the end.
After 3 years in Trinity, Beckett now had a choice. He could stay with the comfortable, secure middle-class life mapped out for him by his family, or he could take a chance, go against their wishes and follow his instincts. With his gold medal in languages and an introduction from his mentor at Trinity, Beckett moved to Paris. He would never live permanently in Ireland again. A decisive moment in his life.
He arrives into Paris. You know that song, How They're Gonna Keep Him Down on the Farm Now That They've Seen
Paris.
That's the one, yeah.
Paris in the 1920s was a fertile and creative city where writers and painters, musicians and dancers, exiles from communist Russia and Prohibition America, lived cheek by jowl. Culturally, it couldn't have been further removed from the Dublin of his childhood.
No prudential morality, which is what he wanted to escape from. And it was escaping into a world of the mind as well as a world of different way of behaving. So that all of this was an opening up, and that's what France represented at the time.
And so through his own innate ability, he finds himself here in the École Normale Supérieure. The college was then, as now, exclusive, admitting only 28 students a year. Beckett's duties as a lecturer in English were not very demanding, and he plunged himself into the vibrancy of Paris's expat cultural life.
What attracted him to Europe, I think, was the idea that there wasn't a fixed notion of a European identity or a European language. There's a fluidity there that he makes an awful lot of. And obviously has an enormous talent for the languages and being able to write in different languages and being able to speak so fluently the different languages that he has a natural affinity and ability.
Beckett's great friend at the college was Thomas McGreevy, who not only introduced him to Paris, but also James Joyce. Joyce's monumental novel Ulysses, an avant-garde classic, had been published in Paris not many years before. It's not hard to see why Beckett was impressed by him.
You're sort of similar to Joyce in what you're thinking, and then you meet Joyce and you get on with Joyce, and Joyce likes you and Joyce rates you. This is the greatest writer in the world at the moment. This is how it is to be a writer. How do I become a writer? This is what I do.
Here we are in the Square Rubaiyat where Joyce lived, and where Beckett would come every day to work with him, read to him, write down things for him, go messages for him. Joyce was his hero. And something very strange here, and to an actor this is very interesting, he started to kind of possess his hero. He started to dress like him, to sit like him, to drink like him, to imitate him, to get inside his head, to understand what that great genius was about.
There's a story that he started wearing shoes that were about a size too small for him because they were the size that Joyce wore, or wore tight shoes or something now. How do I know? But you hear these stories.
Yeah, but I mean,
but it's his kind of a hero worship.
It's his hero worship.
And I mean,
and
just
his
as
friends,
you or I might meet somebody whom we hero worship. Like first time I met Beckett, I was quite in awe of meeting him. I tried not to show it, just be normal, because people like that hate. Most of them hate hero worship, but he hero worshipped other people when he was young.
Just as he had tramped the Wicklow hills with his father in childhood, Beckett now bonded shoulder to shoulder in Paris with his mentor and hero. And so it was here on the Isle of Swans, built bang in the middle of the Seine to protect the port de Grenelle, that you would find Joyce and Beckett walking, sometimes talking, sometimes just deep in thought. Here in Paris, the very epicenter of all that. What a sight that must have been.
He kind of had to be Joyce, didn't he?
Well, that's true, because in the early novel, Dream of Fair to Middling Women, which was only published after his death,
yeah.
Written in 1932 when he was, what, 26, for God's sake. That is very full of Joycean background.
You asked me to give you a task. I think I've given you a big enough task. I long to see the thing you wrote about my beauty, as you call it. I must say, without any compliments, I can't see anything to write about except the usual rot men write about.
It's a very weighty book, weighed down with its own learning, weighed down with its own attitude to literature, very self-conscious.
The book remained unpublished until the 1990s. Paris was more than just a place for meeting other writers. For Sam, it liberated him from the stifling atmosphere of Dublin. Relationships followed, sometimes unorthodox and difficult. In the late 20s, Sam fell deeply in love with the beautiful Peggy Sinclair. She was a modern, sophisticated woman from an art-loving family, but tragically for him, she was also his first cousin. It became clear his family would never allow the relationship to survive.
You have to wonder what effect falling in love so close to home did to him at a very early age. And you can't just discount it as, you know, a crush. It's something deeper than that. And it's frowned upon. And it causes consternation at home because it's too close to home.
I know of one person who fell in love with his first cousin. It's not a nice place to be. Because, you know, convention and morality and so forth.
Absolutely. A first cousin, a close relationship with a family that had been virtually disowned. I think that this was something which was, it was very much persona non grata stuff, wasn't it?
Yeah, his mother would not have been happy with all
and
of
when
that.
he wrote, of course, about that, it really caused something of a rift with the family.
Sam broke off the love affair with Peggy, whose parents' lifestyle was at odds with the straight-laced Becketts.
I always remember as a very young actress reading he was absolutely madly in love with her, and they walked alone a little bit on the beach, and he shivered apparently. And she said, "What's wrong? Are you cold?" And he said, "No, I just shiver sometimes." I don't know why, it's a bit mad, but that captured my imagination as a young woman. I thought it was the most beautiful thing.
Sam's next important encounter with a young woman was arguably even more turbulent for him. James Joyce's daughter, Lucia, became infatuated with Beckett, who had by now become a trusted part of their family life.
Where does she sit, do you think, in terms of, not just in terms of the work, but in terms of him, once again, having to deal with the feminine, you know?
Yes, well, she was throwing herself at him, of course. Yeah. And I think that was a very difficult relationship, and you could understand that he wanted to see James Joyce.
You think Lucia was very much in love with him?
Yeah, desperately so, apparently. He was very kind and loving to her, but not what she wanted.
Not in love?
No, apparently not.
Beckett realized that Lucia's obsession with him could only lead to disharmony, and so he made the difficult decision to shut the door on her advances, which he must have known would lead to a rift with her father.
Famously or infamously, he once said to her, "I came here to see your father, not you." Trouble, and I think Joyce was very upset at this, you know, and there was a breach.
The two men would never be close again. Lucia's already fragile mental health worsened, and she spent much of the rest of her life in an institution.
One of the other striking things about Beckett, who remained faithful as a friend to Lucia forever, for the rest of her life, he had this extraordinary capacity for remaining friends from whom he had, as it were, separated in terms of any kind of close sexual relationship or romantic relationship.
Beckett's rejection of Lucia indeed led to an estrangement with Joyce. Removed from his influence, he drifted. But he also wrote. He entered a poetry competition, and it was a poem, not a play or any fiction, the prize for which was £10, that became his first published work in 1930. Are you ripe at last, my slim, pale, double-breasted turd? This abortion of a fledgling. Beckett becomes depressed with the news that his first love, Peggy, has died of TB. He is untethered further by news from home. Father died last Monday afternoon after an illness lasting just under a week, and was buried last Wednesday morning in a little cemetery on the grey stone side of Bray Head, between the mountains and the sea. I lost my father when he was 50, so I know that that's the kind of the background noise to my whole life in a way. And I think that grief somehow, and grief is very undefinable, but pain makes you articulate. Grief doesn't necessarily, it actually stops you from being articulate.
I don't believe that he ever really got over his father's death.
It was so devastating. All he can do with the father is go out and pay homage to him by walking over the same old places and over the same haunts.
I wish I was in Dublin with a car of my own to bring you out over the country we both love so much, where we've been so often together, where if there is a paradise, Father is still striding along in his old clothes with his dog. At night, when I can't sleep, I do the old walks again and stand beside him again one Christmas morning in the fields near Glencullen, listening to the chapel bells. Or, near the end, in the lee of the rocks at the top of the Three Rock, rubbing his feet with snow to try and bring back the circulation. Almost 10 years after arriving in Paris, a decade in which there was little to show in terms of work, a woman walked into Beckett's life, the remarkable Suzanne de Chevaux de Menil.
He met her, she saved his life. That's the anecdote, the story. He was about to be knifed on the street in Paris, and she was there and nursed him back to health, and basically they never quit each other from that day on.
Suzanne brought him stability and created a space for him to think and write.
They lived together till the end. They had a connecting apartment where they both lived in the same apartment, but there was a connecting door and they both had their separate space.
Beckett seems to come to arrangements. It's not just about love, it's also about friendship. You know, that you can come to an arrangement with a lover that's more of a friendship than it is a passionate relationship. And, you know, the bonds might be very deep. It's very interesting that, you know, Suzanne is there until almost the very end of his own life. And whatever bonds were forged very deeply between them in the early days endured. But presumably they had to be adapted at various stages.
Let's face it and put my cards on the table here, that Beckett, it didn't matter very much, sexual infidelity.
He seemed to very quickly disassociate sex with love.
He could dissociate it, and I think that philandering in that sense didn't matter. The things that mattered were things of the intellect and of the spirit. And some women epitomized for him those aspects.
You wonder how worked out that was. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's the difficulty of trying to comprehend someone's intimate innermost thoughts about their physical needs and their emotional needs and their intellectual needs, and whether or not they can cohere or whether they can combine. I'm not sure they ever fully can, especially for someone like Beckett.
Yes, maybe that's one of the reasons why he liked France. The French tend to be a bit more kind of broad-minded.
Action.
Ce que c'est qu'elle essaie, ce que c'est qu'il faut essayer, n'importe pas lâcher, finir par tomber juste, puis rendu. Dieu est amour, bonté intarissable.
When you're acting Beckett as a woman, he wrote a lot for women, unusual at the time.
Reprendre là, repartir de là, puis Dieu est amour, bonté intarissable.
It's very complete. You really do feel as though he understands women, you know. So women were central to his life.
So the further we travel down this road of trying to understand who this intensely private and shy man, Samuel Beckett, is, the more we get the feeling that we're prying into places that maybe we shouldn't. And James Knowlson's wonderful observation that Beckett is damned to fame starts to ring true, very true.
For our first thought was, oh, long after, sudden flash, brought up as she'd been to believe with the other waves in the merciful...
In May 1940, when the Nazis invaded Paris, Beckett's life was, for the second time, disrupted by a European conflict. He faced a choice. He could turn his back on his adopted home, or, as a citizen of a neutral country, Ireland, he could stay.
The Second World War made a huge impression on him, as he said famously, that I prefer France at war to Ireland at peace.
There is a commitment to his new home of France.
There was a moment that I have never forgotten when he said to me, and he went like this, he said, "After all, Jim, you couldn't stand by with your arms folded," folding his arms, after what they were doing to my Jewish friends. But it was more than that. It was a commitment then to multiracialism, but also a commitment to France.
Beckett's commitment to France was more than just a romantic attachment. He put himself into the firing line and joined the resistance.
I met the head of the resistance there, who was at that cell, and then I met the man that taught Beckett to shoot. He said he was a terrible shot. Heaven only knows what would have happened if he'd had to shoot anybody. He would have missed, you know, they'd have shot him.
He couldn't stand idly by and watch his friends die. He had to take a stand.
Beckett's translation skills and the experience gained working as Joyce's secretary made him a key member of the resistance cell.
It was one of the most exciting and, for me, revealing episodes of a side of Beckett that, of course, he never talked about.
No.
I did get him to tell me about it on one occasion, and he dismissed it like Boy Scout stuff, but nonetheless it was dangerous, and it was a crucial decision, and it meant that he had made the kind of decisive choice that few of us get to make.
This private man worked with characteristic discretion for over 2 years before the Germans cracked the cell.
himself and Suzanne, when they left Paris, they were very, very lucky not to be captured and perhaps killed, you know.
Yeah.
And they left with hours to spare after their cell was betrayed to the Nazis.
Together, they escaped Paris, moving south, sleeping rough. Two figures in a country at war, in a landscape increasingly scarred by conflict.
There's the landscape that he experiences when he's fleeing with other members of the resistance. When, in 1942, they've got to get out of where they are. What do they see on their journey? What kind of landscape is that? Does that find its way into later work? I think it certainly does. And it affects the way he approaches his craft.
Through a contact of Suzanne's, they come here, to the quaint village of Roussillon, among the red rocks and the vineyards. I think there are few places more important in decoding Godot than understanding Roussillon. The Vaucluse and the red soil are all there.
Down there where everything is red, as Vladimir says, and you see the hills there, and they're just the ochre. It's just
That's right.
Pure red, yeah.
It is extraordinary, isn't it?
This is exactly the wasteland, a bare wasteland, and also possibly a futuristic kind of, after the Second World War, a
blasted landscape.
Yeah.
We tend to think of the Wicklow Hills, really, where he kind of walked
He
with
walked
his dad,
so much with his father, yes, yeah.
This is an elusive period in Beckett's life. Catriona is a friend who will help me talk with one of the few people still alive who was with him in Roussillon, Hélène Albertini.
Bien entendu.
Donc c'était...
nous avons eu la chance d'avoir un vieux village et que les Allemands ont trouvé que c'était trop vieux et qu'ils ne pouvaient pas résider dans un village aussi vieux.
Oui.
Ah ben oui, le personnage était très impressionnant parce que il était grand, maigre, il avait un visage coupé au couteau. Oui. C'était très impressionnant. Enfin, pour ma part.
Oui.
He and Suzanne were thrown together with few material comforts. They undertook hard manual work in the vineyards and ate simple peasant food.
Oui, oui, voilà, parce qu'à un moment donné, Beckett, il était obligé de travailler, aller travailler dans la campagne pour pouvoir...
This is the house in which Beckett and Suzanne lived during their time in Roussillon. They kept a low profile as technically they were still on the run. Although Beckett and Suzanne kept their work with the resistance in Paris secret when they got here because it was important to be anonymous, they did let the Maquis store munitions around the property.
On savait qu'il y avait plein de résistants.
Mais personne ne disait rien.
Personne ne disait rien. D'ailleurs, je me souviens très bien que, comme on était au deuxième étage, quand on entendait les avions qui tournaient, on disait là, ils sont en train d'envoyer des munitions. Ah. Et justement, juste au-dessus de la maison Beckett,
on entendait... Ah oui,
oui. Donc... Et ils étaient sur le plateau en haut. Oui. Du pique-bord, ils étaient en train d'envoyer... Enfin, on présumait qu'il y avait des choses qui arrivaient.
Ah oui.
Voilà.
Mais bon, c'était... personne n'a parlé.
Bouche cousue.
Oui.
Towards the end of the war, when the Germans started to make raids, they would hide in a cave, and this recent construction that's been happening has pulled a road through here and knocked down what was left of the cave that they probably hid in, which he had logs built up to conceal the entrance. Beckett and Suzanne were virtual prisoners in the place because the Germans were in Apt and they were in Avignon and they could raid at any particular time. And I think really to escape, he started to write.
If you look at the way he writes up until the change when he becomes a different writer, it closed him in his technique, and he realizes he had to get away from that. And as he says himself, when he has this great revelation, what I had to write about was what was inside me.
He wrote What, that great novel that changed everything, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And he had started it in Paris, but he wrote most of it down in Roussillon. You just know where What is set. The railway station is Harcourt Street. The line is the slow and easy. And the station is Fox Rock and where What gets off the train. But it's not mentioned by name.
When the war finished, Beckett longed to return to Paris, but he also wanted to help the ruined country, to give something back. He went to Normandy.
He volunteered for the Irish Red Cross going to the town of Saint-Lô in Normandy, which had been bombed out of existence by the Allies in, I think it was June 1945. And he worked there with the Irish Red Cross as storekeeper and interpreter, van driver and rat catcher at one stage. And that was called the capital of the ruins, the Capitale des Ruines. And that was where he worked for a good few months until early '46.
It's been raining hard the last few days and the place is a sea of mud. What it will be like in the winter is hard to imagine.
There's an awful lot of internalised trauma finds its way through Beckett's work after the Second World War. You know, this search for meaning. There's a nihilism there, struggling, of course, to make sense not just of his own personal voyage to try and find his own voice, but concepts of home, of stability, of what's it all about, you know? What does memory do? Where do we belong?
Yes, all those things would be thrown up by the kind of how people are so displaced after major wars.
And landscape too.
Is there a moment, do you think, that you could pinpoint, or is it a gradual thing where he kind of goes, now I know?
It is to do with the war years, the capital of the ruins and Saint-Lô, when he realizes there that all this knowledge, what has it brought him to? It's brought him to a sense that Joyce has done all the putting everything in. He realizes that life and work have to be brought together in a different way.
He saw the way he had to go, that his success, not a word he'd use, would be in penury rather than plenitude, and that to write about things that are less rather than more. He talked about Joyce being the great doer, the great canner, whereas he was one who everything was cut down.
It's to do again with death and the fact of nothingness and non-being, and go into that darkness, this revelation with the dark and the light, but that his world is exploring that inner world of the being and non-being.
After Beckett and Suzanne returned to Paris in 1946, he developed what he believed was a malignant tumour in his cheek. Locking himself away for 2 fiercely creative years in what he called the siege in the room, he wrote 3 novels and the play that would change everything. On this street here, his great play, Godot, opens in French, and the rest, as they say, is history.
To reduce it down to the bare essentials, 2 characters talking to each other, and to go, rien à faire, nothing to be done. The opening line from Godot just took everybody by surprise. Even the French didn't know what to make of that.
He hated Waiting for Godot. He said that to me. He said, I can't stand that play.
Why do you think, I mean...
He just couldn't. I said to him,
he had less
I had the cheek to say to him, well, I think it's been absorbed, you know, that Godot has been absorbed.
It's now a thing.
It's a thing, and everybody now thinks they know it, and it's all fine, you know. And he said, that's it.
What am I to tell Mr. Godot, sir?
Tell him you saw me, and that you saw me. You're sure you saw me? You won't come and tell me tomorrow that you never saw me!
So I've met some of the wonderful people who knew Sam, and I've walked in the places that mattered to him, the bleak landscapes, the silence, the lightness, the water.
However it moves towards abstraction, there is still compassion at the center, at the core of his work. And that was what always drew me to the work of Samuel Beckett.
We'll hang ourselves tomorrow. Unless Godot comes.
In the future, if somebody wants to see a writer who talks about the essence of what it is to be in the world in the 20th century, Samuel Beckett will be the man.
I believe Samuel Beckett was right in saying his work was separate from his life. Yes, there was danger and bleak days, soul-searching and a broken heart. But there was always friendship and kindness and humour. He became one of the great European writers of any age, and in doing so, changed the way the world thinks about itself.
Nothing is left to tell.
I would have been privileged to have spent just one evening in his company.
Nothing is left to tell.